It raises the question, is far-right extremism a problem here in Canada? Here to discuss the issue, we're welcoming Reverend Anthony Bailey, Rabbi Ihsaan and Ihsaan Gardee from the National Council of Canadian Muslims. Gentlemen, thank you all so much for joining us to discuss this issue today.
Happy to be here.
I want to get right into the fact that we're learning that some Canadians have been identified as among those in the white supremacist, anti-Nazi side of this march in Charlottesville over the weekend. Your reaction to learning Canadians were a part of this? We'll start with you, Reverend Bailey.
Yeah, it's not a surprise. We know from police services across the country that there are over 100 white supremacist groups under investigation or surveillance in Canada. We only have to look at what happened earlier this year in Quebec City with Ihsaan went into a mosque and killed 6 people. What we know is within 48 hours there were some 59 reports of hate crime. So it seemed to have engendered some kind of impetus. I'm not surprised. We also hear reports that there was a van with Ontario plates at the same rally in Charlottesville.
Rabbi, your take on this, is it concerning to you? Are you surprised to learn Canadians may have been involved here?
Not surprised, certainly. As a Jew, our community is the most targeted community for hate crimes in this country, so certainly not surprised. But on the other hand, we also take into account and also remember that for every one of these white supremacists that do exist, there are a lot more allies. Canada is the best country to exist in for any minority group. So unfortunately not surprising, but also trying to remember that other side of the story as well.
Mr. Gardee, there was one of these men has been identified as being part of an anti-Muslim group out of Quebec. That must be concerning to you, that we have a Canadian going out there allegedly a part of a group that is against the people you represent.
And I would agree with Reverend Bailey and Rabbi Ihsaan that, again, it's not surprising, but obviously still very, very concerning. This is something that our security forces, CSIS, has been noting that there has been a rise in right-wing extremism, and Professor Barbara Perry from the University of Ontario Institute of Technology and Ryan Scrivens have been studying this phenomenon. They've got a 3-year study they've been undertaking looking at right-wing extremism, and as Reverend Bailey said, over 100 right-wing extremist groups are operating in Canada of various sizes, and there's also, a concern about growing online hate as well. In January, there was a CBC Marketplace study that noted a 600% uptick in the use of hate language online, including 300% increase in right-wing extremist language, as well as a 200% increase in Islamophobic language. And you see this growth of this online environment, which is deeply concerning. You have a group in Quebec called La Meute, which has over 43,000 Facebook friends. And, one has to wonder, this kind of environment, what is it facilitating in terms of emboldening people to actually act out on these kinds of ideologies?
And that's where I want to go next, because when we see what's happening in Charlottesville, does that give the people in these groups the permission in their minds, let's say, to start acting on their beliefs? Are we worried that, you've all in your respective communities been the target of hate crimes. Your church was vandalized earlier, for example. You've all experienced that. So are we going to see more of it now in larger groups with more people involved because it's happening in the States and some people feel that now they can start acting upon their thoughts?
I think there's been an emboldening, and unfortunately the leadership in the United States, in terms of the president, has not helped at all. And in fact, I think it's made it worse. But the border is not a barrier to the kind of, the kind of information online, the kind of stimulus that is taking place. I think there is an emboldening. We're saying, we look recently in Halifax, the Proud Boys. We're seeing examples within Canada of the same kind of communication and expression, public expression, and it is concerning and alarming. But as Rabbi Sher said, I think we have to remember that there are people of goodwill in Canada who are very much allies around various communities who want to stand up and be counted and to say this is not appropriate, this is wrong. And I think we have to be able to speak out and to demonstrate in very tangible ways what love looks like, what respect looks like, what inclusion looks like.
If we were to look at the differences between our two nations, in our country we have hate crimes. You can be charged with a hate crime, for example, putting a swastika up on a church. It's not just considered vandalism. It's a far more serious crime than vandalism. In the U.S., they don't have that. It infringes on the right First Amendment, so they don't have that kind of law. Are our laws what guide us to have less violence and perhaps not see what is happening in Charlottesville? Are our laws strong enough, or should they be even stronger?
I think that the hate crimes and hate speech laws in Canada certainly do play a role in putting all of those in check, putting all of that hatred in check, those public displays of hatred in check. But of course, every community and we as a country need to make sure that all of the protocols are in place, all the necessary protocols are in place, and strengthening of laws where needed in order to make sure that that we don't see these types of things becoming more and more.
What are you hearing from your communities? What are you hearing from the Muslim community here in Ottawa? Are they concerned with what's going on in the U.S.? Are they fearful at all?
There is concern being expressed that I've heard about what's happening, not just in the U.S., but as well what's happening here in Canada. It is very easy to look across the border and to see, what is going on here. But we also have to remember that racism has a long history here in Canada, whether we're talking about the residential school system, the Japanese internment, more recently issues around police carding. It's something that we have to recognize exists here, and Canada is not immune from this phenomenon. We have to work together, and as Rabbi Ihsaan said as well, our laws certainly play an important role, but we have to remember as well that we cannot legislate out hatred. This is a multifaceted problem, and it's going to take a multifaceted approach to solving it. That's going to have to involve various stakeholders, whether it's government, whether it's law enforcement, educators. We know that from the latest report from Statistics Canada that came out in June, that the vast majority of those who are targeted by hate crimes are under the age of 18. So that also points to the fact that education is going to play an incredibly important role. And we have seen education campaigns like Break the Behavior, as well as Toronto for All being conducted by municipalities. Those kinds of things have to continue, along with education around the need for reporting. Statistics Canada also tells us that up to 2/3 of hate crimes go unreported. So what we're seeing is just the tip of the iceberg.
Are you gentlemen doing anything specific in your own respective communities to help facilitate that education and inform your congregations, your communities of how to report it and how to be accepting of others and how to make sure that we stop this right here in our own community?
Yeah, I think one of the initiatives we do have conversation within our congregation, but for instance, you made a reference to the young man who did racist graffiti in Muslim and Jewish and our church, and we have entered into a collaborative restorative justice process trying to see if we can rehabilitate. So I think we have to try to find ways in which we can, in a material and constructive way, help, but also to speak about this, be vigilant and cooperate with our allies also.
I just want to get your reactions before we finish up to the fact that the leader of the United States, the leader of the free world, has gone back on comments, calling out a couple days ago the white supremacists, calling out the KKK, calling out the neo-Nazis as being thugs, as being the ones responsible for this violence. And then just a day later coming back and saying, no, everybody was involved in this violence. What message does that send, not to just his country, but the world? When it comes to racism, bigotry, and what we're seeing right now, when the most powerful man in the world won't even call it out for what it really is. Rabbi, we'll start with you.
Obviously that moral equivalency that the President of the United States showed was deeply disturbing and very troubling. I also think, though, that we have to remember that bigotry and racism existed far before he took power. It exists regardless of who it is that's sitting in the White House. But of course, that's very troubling. And we as Canadians and we globally as human beings have to make sure that that message does not become, the message that that it all shapes the mindset of our humanity. I just do want to point out it's a very fascinating contrast just to who we are as Canadians and living here in Ottawa as well. This rally of hatred in Charlottesville, they had weeks to promote it, and they brought out about several hundred people. In November, when after our institutions we were graffitied with these very hateful messages, we had about 24 hours to create some sort of rally, some sort of response, and we had over 1,000 people crowd into our synagogue to display the love and respect for all human beings. So I want to point that out as well. So very troubling, but I think we do have our allies, as Reverend Bailey pointed out as well.
And there are some planned nationalist parties rallies coming up in the near future. There's one in Vancouver. There's also one in Toronto scheduled that they're trying to organize. How do we, if we want to get the message out that don't be a part of that, be a part of good, be a part of where our society has come as opposed to going back to where we have been. What's your final message to your communities and to Canadians as a whole to stand up against that type of behavior?
For people to be vigilant and to speak out, to attend those rallies, to demonstrate by their physical presence that they are against this kind of hatred.
To take personal responsibility, that it's up to us as individuals to speak out, that we can't rely on others to always say something, that when we say or when we see something or hear something, that it's important that we speak out, whether it's inappropriate jokes or things in the workplace. If those aren't stopped, then it gives an impression that it's okay, these things are okay.
All right, we're going to leave it right there. Gentlemen, thank you all so much for joining us on this panel discussion on a very hot button issue in our society today. We appreciate your time.